awareness, right? How others are impacted by our decisions, how we're impacted by other folks' decisions, and the cognizance of implicit bias, and that cognizance of not that you're going to be able to catch every bias, but you're aware that you are not exempt from holding any biases, any harmful stereotypes or beliefs about other people or ethnic groups or cultural groups. In adultification, the two definitions, so one that speaks to a mature developmental stage because of situational context and necessity. So we hear a lot of times about kids having to look after their younger siblings, and typically what happens is when kids have to show up in a more mature space, oftentimes in a home setting, they come into school or the youth-based organizations that they're a part of, and they tend to do what we call disruption. Here is where, I always say we have to look at it as, is this a place where the child feels safe enough to be a child, right? And understanding that this is a child seeking connection, right? So even shifting from attention seeking to connection seeking. And also understanding that it's a social cultural stereotype that is based on how adults perceive children and the absence of knowledge of children's behavior and verbalizations, this lighter form of adultification, which is based in part on race. And then we watched our Girlhood Interrupted video, which we'll skip. And now it's next Thursday, so here we are. So for the last portion of our training, well, the second to last portion of our training, we're going to discuss dismantling internal systems and frameworks of oppression. Part of why we say dismantle internal systems, frameworks of oppression, I cannot talk today, I'm so sorry, is because we understand that this work leads with self. And so we have, there are some folks who believe like we're going to, we have to address racism on a structural level, but have relatively low understanding of how it has impact on the personal level, the interpersonal level first. And we have to have that duality and understanding, because we need to recognize when we are talking about dismantling, transforming a system, and when it's an interpersonal, it's a belief that is, what's the word that I'm looking for? I cannot speak today. Laurel, help me. I wish you were in my mind so you can know what I was trying to say.
Say your phrase again.
Understanding that we put more value into dismantling on an institutional level, not recognizing that there's a lot of work that has to be done on the personal.
Because it's been internalized. Right. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. But it was something else too, but that's okay. It'll come back to me. Okay. And so we'll go through the matrix of oppression. We'll watch Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's video on intersectionality. I know there's a lot of people in the group who are familiar with the term intersectionality. We'll discuss anti-Blackness, and then if we have a little time, we will do some exploring of the impact of the frameworks that we've internalized and some of the trauma as well. So if you do not already, and I think Laurel put it in the group, but if you have paper to jot down for the activities, that would be good. If you want to pull up Microsoft Word or whatever you have on your device, that would work as well. All right, so the first thing we have is the matrix of oppression. And so you'll see it over here. It needs to be radically updated. They came out in 2007 from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. It needs to be updated in terms of there's a lot of social locations on here, social groups that are not acknowledged, and definitely should be included in this so that we can really have those conversations that we need, where when we build our community, especially in this climate, nobody is left behind or erased. You'll see also on the left that we also have some values to work with as we go through the matrix of oppression. And so we ask that you work to name the oppressions we each identify with, try our best to articulate the unique ways the oppressions we face intersect, ensure we have a sound foundation of our definition of intersectionality, acknowledge our privileges even within the frameworks of oppression, and resist the urge to dismiss an idea simply because we have no frame for it. Does anyone have any question? What questions do you all have for me before we move forward?
Are we going into breakout rooms now?
Yes, so I was gonna say,
so if you could give an example of one of the categories so people know exactly, you know, what we're gonna do.
Yep, so I was gonna explain the thanks, Leah.
So I am in your head.
Yes, you are. Now. How convenient is that? So what we're gonna do is on your piece of paper, when you break out into your small group, we'll be in our small groups for 45 minutes. You are going to take a look at the social identity category, and you're going to fill out where you are in each one. And then what we'll do in our small group then is each person will go around and share out where their social location is. And here's where I add my little asterisk. Again, this is voluntary and it's certainly okay. And I want to recognize that in this day and age, although folks, we all say that we are inclusive and we're safe spaces and we are open to everyone, we still have to be mindful of safety, even when we are no longer in this community that we're building right now. So please honor if someone chooses to skip a social identity category or reframe in a certain way. We want to honor everybody and what they feel comfortable and safe contributing to the conversation. And then once we go through that, once we go through each one, we'll come back as a large group and we'll just debrief on the activity. And then if there are folks who do feel comfortable sharing, we'll have space for that as well. Any questions before we break out into our larger groups?
I do. I have another one really quick. Do I stop recording or will this just record our group?
That is a very good question. Leanne, do you know by any chance?
I'm not sure.
Leanne, I don't know as well, which I feel like I failed you as your intern. I'm sorry. I feel like it should just like
record the breakout rooms.
You said it does?
It does not record the breakout rooms unless you tell it to record, and you can check in the breakout rooms to make sure it's not recording if you don't want it to be recording.
And we can
just pause it. Maybe I should just pause it until we come into the big room.
That would work too, just to be safe.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted us all to take a minute and debrief, but I also want to make sure that we get to the rest of the content for the evening. So so hopefully we'll have enough time at the end. And if folks have some quick thoughts, reflections from this activity, we'll leave room at the end to share. So what we're going to see next is the video from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, where she explores intersection.
Okay, wait, is Priya back?
I was waving vigorously, but you didn't see me. Hi.
I can't see it.
Okay. Priya, are you in here? Is your group in here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Before we move on from this category, do you think you can just very quickly explain what the categories border, privilege, and the other one mean real quick?
So privilege is where we experience benefits from our society and the way that our society is structured because we are based in this social location. And so just for sake of time, for a good example, if we're talking where it says like privileged social group for race, or it says white person, when we talk about white privilege, like we talk about the ability to move in and out of certain spaces without with low risk of coming into interaction with police or any type of carceral system or carceral response if there's a conflict and it escalates. When we're talking about border social groups, there are people who can, based on maybe physical features, based on maybe who they are socially close to in terms of proximity, may experience some of those benefits, those societal benefits, but at any time those can be redeemed, right? Those can be, I'm sorry, not redeemed, those could be revoked based on this person's own personal convention or understanding of how society is built and choosing to maybe go against that status quo. here is a good where we talked about in our group, board of social groups, we talked about specifically what it meant to be queer or bisexual and how that can show up as a board of social group location based on the fact that there are some people who identify as queer or bisexual, and a person will look at them and assume that because they are presenting as masculine or presenting as female, they're gender conforming, that they automatically assume that they are heterosexual, right? Until they say otherwise. Targeted social groups means that we know that structurally, systemically, there are things put in place to serve as a barrier. Does that make sense to everyone? If not, say something, because I can't see you because the power.
Michael said kind of. So if you could maybe, I saw him, so maybe other people.
Okay. So what I would say is let's watch this video, because this video will definitely give more, will give you all give more of a framework for understanding. What I wanted you all to see here as you did the matrix of oppression on your own is that when we're talking about systems of oppression, we're talking about the things that we've internalized about the groups that we identify with, is that it's not an either or thing. Part of white supremacist, part of living in a punitive society is that things are binary. We need binary in order to enforce rules, in order for things to be criminalized. And so understanding that, one, we can cause harm, and we can cause harm and we can be harmed. And being harmed does not negate you of that. And vice versa. So I'll play the video, and hopefully that will give you all a more clear understanding. Also in recognizing too, that when we have these conversations and we're building community, oftentimes we mistake, because we identify with a person based on one specific social location, that we are not, that we don't have any capacity to also weaponize or cause them any of that social harms. I hope that makes sense, Michael, but if not, the video will help greatly. All right, let's see.
Barb, we can't see anything.
What?
We can't see anything.
Oh my word.
We can hear it.
Can you? Oh,
Here.
hold on. Probably because I have to share the screen, Laurel. Thank you.
Black girls need less nurturing.
Psych. All right, there we go.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm gonna name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're gonna see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown. Tamir Rice. Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you could be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are two issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, two issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them do not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the back seat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers? It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. The everyday violence and humiliation that many Black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness.
And I'm actually going to stop the video there because I want to be honest that as a Black woman, I'm personally tired of seeing Black people in videos being brutalized and humiliated in various ways in order for folks to get the point and understanding about oppression and what it means when we're complicit in the white supremacist patriarchal society that we're in. And I think that if you have to see Black people being brutalized and humiliated in any kind of way to develop some type of empathy or understanding of what's going on, that's something that has to be worked on offline, separately, privately, not with a Black person. So, I'm gonna go through and then we'll come through that and debrief. I know folks are processing because a lot of information has been shown, and especially when we think about, the matrix of oppression and where we stand, and also the work that we do. A lot of us, we recognize that we are working within harmful institutions. We are working within the same institutions that that is responsible for a lot of the violence that a lot of our peers, a lot of us experience. And we know that based on our social locations and our own personal beliefs and convictions, that we have some influence, some sway in how society functions, and that it can impact a lot of people. And unfortunately for a lot of us, because we are within these when sometimes, not sometimes, but what happens is us being in social locations and often receiving benefit from that social location, and not pushing against that status quo, we are often blind, right? Or not in close proximity to the actual impact on the people who are not within that social location, who can receive those same benefits. Let's see. So we came up with what we call query, question, understanding, empathy, reiterating the community truth, and yes. We couldn't find anything for the why, so yes, like just joy of celebration. And so we were thinking, like, when we talk about how do we start to, and when we begin our process of decolonizing for Black, Brown, Indigenous peoples, unsettling for white people, and we're talking about the changing our internal messaging, where do we start? Even as we're talking about being in our interpersonal relationships with other people, where do we start? How do we start to develop a growth mindset, a restorative mindset that is one, reflective, right? And also takes proactive measures to seek out the messaging, the messaging and the harmful biases that we take in from our society, and be willing to deconstruct them on a daily basis, not just in how we're thinking and what we're saying, but also our actions and what we're doing. And so the first part of that with query, which is missing, is our questions, the restorative questions. When I send out the slides to you all, the PDF notes, it will be on there. But the questions being open-ended, asking restorative questions: what happened? What were you thinking? How were you feeling at the time? What have you thought about since then? What could be done differently? And how do we make this right? Asking those questions to allow for the story to come out. Asking them with a tone, which we'll talk about, and again, not in a neutral tone, however, in a tone that encourages for story to come out and community to be developed. Listening to hear rather than to respond. Taking the time to connect. Perspective taking. Staying out of judgment, right? And so saying what I would have done, right? If you were not asked what you would have done. Recognizing emotion in others and stopping there. Oftentimes what we see, especially when we're working with youth, and let's say two youth get into a physical altercation and someone says, well, they threw the pencil at me, right? And we'll say, they'll say, I'm mad because she threw the pencil at me. And then we'll say, I understand you're mad, but, right? And we all know that but is a negator of everything that came before. And so here we want to say, I understand your anger. And we also have to talk about the ways in which we respond and use our anger, right? Acknowledging that something in us knows that feeling. A lot of us mistake empathy as you have to have been in that situation in order to understand it. We recognize that empathy is being able to recognize and acknowledge another person's emotions and being able to see when you've also felt those emotions, right? And so while I may have been sad that my boyfriend and I broke up 2 weeks ago. It's not true, but my boyfriend, and I don't got no man, but my boyfriend and I broke up 2 weeks ago, right? And I'm feeling sad about that. And then, Newton, let's say that Newton, you're feeling sad, and I'm sharing that with you, right? And you're like, I've never been sad to break up with my partner. Like, it's always been a joy, a source of relief or joy for me, right? You can say, I have, however, felt sad when my grandmother passed away because I know what it's like to lose someone, right? And so being able to make the connection between the emotion. Providing space for vulnerability serves better than a response. I don't know if you all are familiar with Dr. Brene Brown's work, but one of the biggest things she always says is, it's certainly okay to not have a response. Sometimes no response is the best response. It's just the physical act of being there, right? We live in a society where, we live in a capitalist society. And so productivity and always having a solution to the problem is something that is expected. And the reality of it is we don't always have that right away. And so we have to remember that it's not about trying to fix things, right? It's not about trying to solve other people's problems. It's just a matter of building community and building it in an intentional and a connected way. How's your proximity? your posture and your message, right? So we want to use directives versus passive demands. There's research that shows that Black children specifically respond better to directives than passive demands. And I want to be clear, directive demands does not mean that we are in the punitive box. We're not yelling at kids. We're not telling them, you know, go over there right now and put it like this, right? This is understanding that there are cultural differences down to how we communicate. And this is something that even I have experienced in a classroom with white teachers, white women teachers, the passive demands. So the example here is, hey, Brandon, don't you think it's time to put the scissors away? Well, the problem with that is that we gave Brandon what?
Agency or choices.
We gave him choice, right? We gave him choice. We gave him agency, we gave him choice. In that moment, did we want to give him choice and agency? Right? Especially because if we're thinking about in that moment, like we're asking, what are we asking him to put the scissors away for, right? There's an activity coming up. There may be a fire drill, right? And so in this moment where you just simply needed Brandon to put the scissors away, you've now created a conversation, right? You've now created a situation where the environment can be negotiated. Right. So what happens when you say, when it says to Brandon, hey, Brandon, don't you think it's time to put the scissors away? And Brandon says, no. Right. What typically happens in the classroom? Brandon is now seen as being defiant or disrespectful, right? Not following directions, because in his mind, he's been given a choice. Right. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which we communicate to people, think about the messaging that you're sending. Right. And so here we say use directives. Brandon, put the scissors away. We are moving on to the next activity. Right. Also remembering that when we're working with youth, we have to honor no, right? And we have to lean in with curiosity and figuring out where that no comes from. Even as adults, again, right, being able to check ourselves and seeing the spaces in which we give ourselves the space to say no, right? But we struggle with giving children that same space. And being clear that in a directive demand, like there is clear explanation of what's happening, like in terms of, you know, where we need to be, and then the timeline, right? And where we need to go. And then proxemics, right? So it's the space that's seen as an extension of self, typically 1 foot, 3 feet distance. These days, you know, this time, 6 feet ain't gonna kill you. 12 might be even better, right? So being aware of your body, being aware of the other person's body, demonstrating self-awareness helps to de-escalate or escalate the situation. So and this is exactly when you, in combination with posture as well, right? We want a non-threatening posture, one that allows for escape in the conversation, especially when we're talking about folks who are impacted by trauma, right? If you're talking to a person who is physically smaller than you and you're leaning over them and your hands are in your pockets and you're squaring off with them, and it's like, how come you were late last week, right? This now becomes a challenge, and this can kick someone's fight or flight response, and they're most likely going to fight, become defensive, and shut down, right? And so we want to make sure that I always say to stand toe to toe with a person. And so make sure that our body is when their body is facing forward, our body is to the side, and we can always swivel our upper body. And we want to make sure we keep our hands where people can see them, because we want to make sure that people feel safe and know that they have agency in the conversation, even if you're having a conversation with them, recognizing the privilege that you have within that relationship. And then responding with empathy and understanding, right? So using cognitive empathy and listening. It seems like you wish, again, asking those restorative questions, even when you're tempted to respond. And what I tell folks all the time is, like, as you're getting comfortable with asking restorative questions, it's okay to just follow through until you feel like you're ready to start to use them, lean into them more with a little conversation and even asking follow-up questions, because a lot of us, you know, it's easier said than done. You recognize how much of the conversations you have with other people, especially with youth, are very one-sided, and that we struggle very much so with open-ended questions, especially with youth, and just giving them that room to share without interrogating or trying to poke holes in their stories. And then finally, making sure that we reiterate, right? We want to make sure that we go back, we restore, right, that person's full humanity. So going back and reiterating a community message, right? Regrounding the community, regrounding the person, the relationship, and a value that the community strongly believes in, right? I'm so glad that you were able to show folks what it looks like to take accountability. I appreciate the way that you show orderliness every time when you come into the building, right? I appreciate the example that you set for the group in showing grace to people who make mistakes, right? There's so many ways that we can build one another up, especially our youth, if we're willing to trust each other and give each other the space to make mistakes and contribute knowledge to our relationships. Making sure that we show appreciation and also acknowledging feelings and needs, even if we feel like the person, the needs that the person needs are ridiculous or dramatic, right? Remember, they are not your needs, they are someone else's. And your job as a person, a part of their community and their life, is to provide support in the best way you can to help them meet those needs, and vice versa.
Something that I learned recently, that negative voice we have in our head when we think that we're not doing what we're supposed to, or when imposter syndrome comes in, it's usually, sadly, from our parents when they used to say things to motivate us, but they said it in a way that was like, why did you do that? You know? So that negative voice is usually what we built in. So now that I am such a restorative mother and I've rocked it, I haven't. I talk to my sons about like some of the stuff I see it manifesting. And when they are frustrated or spill something or do something, I hear me. So I actually had to have that conversation like, my bad, you know, that what you think, that's not a big deal. You spilling that isn't. I did make it a big deal. Back then I was going through some stuff and it was, but it's not. And this is why it isn't. So I actually am still unpacking things that I have put in their head over the years because I didn't know.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurel. So it's 8:55. I know that we're ending at 9. I am committed to staying on. Y'all not getting me past 9:20 because I got a stats final to finish. But I'm committed to staying on until 9:20 for a conversation around the video, as well as the matrix of oppression. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and start to close us out. So here are some things that could be the antithesis to query, right? These are some things, here are some sayings, some beliefs that we are invested in our current society, in the way that we build relationships and even function now. The yes, but, which I just explained, you know, when someone shares how they're feeling or what led them to behave in a certain way, right? Saying, I get that, but, right? So not acknowledging that person's humanity. Part of restorative practices, restorative justice, is acknowledging that people are not defined by their behaviors. And so recognizing that a person who causes harm is just as entitled to their humanity and dignity as a person who has been harmed, and that in sharing their feelings and what they were thinking about, that gives us room and an opportunity for us to discover ways to, one, restore the harm that's been caused, restore the humanity that has been disrupted, but also to take a look at that nucleus, that structural harm, that structure, those structural inequities that we talked about, and start to understand there in the solutions. Emphasizing the needs of other students or another person prior to showing empathy to the current student or the person, like we just said, and then responding with little or no use of equitable lens, race, gender, trauma. And so one of the things that comes up often is like when when Black, white, brown, Indigenous women are having a conversation, and something that I've experienced is when I'm sharing a hardship that I have as a Black woman, and then a white woman may respond and say, well, I just think that it's hard for all women, right? And so or even, you know, when we look at our youth and we're seeing and recognizing what young Black girls are experiencing, and we may try to flatten that, right? By saying, well, I just think that, again, right, I just think it's something that all little girls are experiencing, or understand, or looking at trauma and saying, well, that's why, you know, we have to give space for grit or resiliency, and recognizing that Some of the responses we have to trauma-informed care are once again putting the onus on the people who are most impacted by those situations and not giving room for us as a society and community to recognize and take accountability and start to make those changes.
Or briefly, query again, what does it stand for?
Question, understanding, empathy, responding, and yes. Yep, you had it right, Laurel, respond. So any questions or comments? Reflection.
Commitments.
Commitments, yes. This is an open floor until 9:20 and then I gotta go. And you can go off mute and ask, or put it in the chat box.
Everybody tired.
I know.
I am tired, but I'm going to ask the question.
This has been wonderful. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm still processing the matrix of oppression, and the middle border one is, I'm trying to make sense of it still, because on some of those I see they don't seem like an oppressed class, and some of them seem like even more so than the target. So that's where I'm. Help me understand that better if you can, and if you can't, that's okay too.
So when we say border, right? So when we say border, we're thinking about proximity, right? And so for the first one, it has biracial people, right? If we're looking at that through, and there are biracial people in the room, but if they feel comfortable, but I don't want to tokenize anybody, certainly. So when we're saying border social group, it's recognizing for some folks, right, they can say, trying to think of a way to explain this at 9 o'clock when I'm utterly tired.
Hey, Barbara, can I give it a shot?
Yes, please. I was gonna say,
this is
my brain is failing me right now. Terribly.
This is Lisa, and I'm going to try to be super efficient and hope that nobody finds this hurtful, right? So when you're talking about this in the border and the racial space, right? If you're talking about biracial people who have, some of their parents are European descended, or they have a lighter skin tone, right? There are privilege issues there, right? So the first Black president of the United States is biracial, right? And I would argue personally, right, that it's not a mistake when you look at this particular country and our issues associated with anti-Blackness, et cetera, that
go halfway.
But yeah, folks were, well, I mean, I don't know that people view him that way consciously, right?
Yeah.
But that he does not have the connection to the Black experience of slavery in this country, right, makes him on some levels more palatable or less complicated, or, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we are having a version of this conversation now with Kamala Harris, right? Folks are out there, well, is she Black enough? Is she Asian? Does she identify? We are getting, as a Black person, right, who, like Kamala Harris, is also an immigrant, I'm getting such an education in how little white people know about the history of Black people when they left the African continent. Right? Somebody got up 2 nights ago, somebody with a lot of following, I don't know, some kind of talking head on Twitter, suggesting that Kamala Harris was, that she was descended from people who owned slaves. Well, that's also true of Sally Hemings, who's, was owned, enslaved, sexually assaulted by Thomas Jefferson, right? Her descendants were also related to white people who owned slaves, right? and folks who somehow think that because Kamala Harris is Black, but her family wasn't enslaved here, that she is not descended from or connected to slavery, because they don't understand that the ships that dropped off Black people on the continent of North America dropped other Black people off in the Caribbean who were also enslaved before those ships came here, right? So that's that construct, and how those various intersections combine to make things more complicated and put people either in proximity to that which is considered to be acceptable or more powerful, or have more power along the spectrum of social identity.
But I think, to follow up with Lisa, the other flip coin of that is that those middle groups also can sometimes put you in proximity to being targeted and excluded, right? So as a Black woman that's not mixed, that looks like myself, very often I'm excluded everywhere, right? Like, the white people don't want me because I make them uncomfortable because of what my skin tone represents of the Sally Hemings history of our country. And the Black people don't want me because I make them uncomfortable and angry by what happened with the Sally Hemings history of our country, right? And so I think that's why there's that border group, Michael, right? Like, it's a flow there, right? So it's not that these people, first of all, I think this is a very old chart.
It is. It is.
I did look at the dates.
I have been saying for
2007.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've been saying for a year that I'm going to update it, and I'm taking a sabbatical from my program, and so I'm actually going to spend some time to see if I can update this, because it definitely needs some love and affection, and I'm grateful that you all are bringing this up, because it's also speaking to a structural thing too. And thank you both, because my brain was, I ain't gonna make it, right? I was like, I don't even know where to start, because, and also, with this activity in person, it's such a visual story for people. And so it really doesn't take much for me to facilitate it, because people are leading with I, and here's where I stand, that people who don't understand can see that and say, this makes sense. And it's not just an interpersonal personal thing. It's also, it's a policy thing too, right? Because when we talk about the middle class, we're looking at it right now. Middle class are folks who are making $400,000 in combined a year, right? That's a huge gap. That means we now have middle class, wealthy class, and then we have working poor people. Like, there's no in between anymore, right? And so when we say border social groups, that means that anytime there could be a change in the way our society functions, there could be a shift in capitalism, right? And anybody, depending on where they are in race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, right? Depending on where they are in those groups, and they could be middle class, something happens, they're now in working class, depending on where else they are, race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, they could also be more exposed, right? And again, not just to those interpersonal relationships, but also policy. So even as we're having this conversation, again, right, I'm glad that you brought up, Obama and Kamala, because even now as we're having this conversation, and the big thing around it is discourse. The big discourse around it, right, is one, representation, right, but also understanding folks, what's the word I'm looking for? Folks, identity politics, right? And so the question that has been on the table that that as a society, we're all struggling to answer, right, is what does it mean, right, for us to have a person of a marginalized group, right, be in a position of power within a white supremacist framework, right? And what impact does that have on those who are also within that marginalized group who do not have access to said power? Does that make sense, Michael?
Yeah. Barbara, I also want to add the frame of economic vulnerability, because I think you can look at legacies of institutionalized economic marginalization in the targeted group and see that really clearly. Economic privileges in the privilege group. And I think you can look at the border group as an area of sort of economic insecurity, where you don't necessarily have all the marginalization of a targeted social group, but you also don't have access to the economic privilege of the privileged social group.
Right.
And I think you can look at that in every category and see that just sort of in pay disparities in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like even speaking as a millennial, right? And like I've accumulated this mass amount of debt. And I tell people all the time, like I have a 4-bedroom house that I'm never gonna live in, right? And there's some truth to that, right? Because even now we're having this, today's Black women's equal pay day, right?
Yeah,
So in looking at all of the places where I stand, right? And then to say, well, now I'm looking at the system and being told like you take this route, right, in order for you to go upward, to move upward in society, right? And at the same time, there's also some penalty in that based on my social location groups, right? Because I'm glad you brought up economics, because what does that mean to be the third, fourth person, right? To be the third, fourth generation of a family whose first recording or memory in this country is being enslaved, being property. Right? What does that mean, right? When you're now trying to play catch up and you have to borrow from the same systems who intentionally didn't recognize you for 300-400 years.
Mm-hmm.
Or affirmatively discriminated against someone in your family when they came back from World War II and had redlining issues, so couldn't get that boost into the middle class by buying a nice home in the suburbs that white men were able to do.
Mm-hmm. And what I also appreciate about this is that this leaves room for us to really start to question, even though it feels uncomfortable, even though that means that, the feeling the feeling of threat of our own livelihood comes up, right? As we think about the ways in which our social locations and what we benefit from and what we invest in, how they put other people, even people who look like us, in grave danger. And are we willing to live with that, even though we know that the outcome of that means that disconnects in our community, there's distrust, right? Which is justified, right? It's justified when we think about, it may not be you specifically, but the systems, the things that we represent, right? And how are we going to make amends with that? And are we willing to part ways with those things if the folks from our community say that in order for us to be a whole community, this is what has to happen. This is how we have to come to the table and have these conversations. This is what I need for you to be able to see and understand.
Can I ask one question simply for the reference list?
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that the person who mentioned this last week is still here. Somebody mentioned a particular book or writing or something. I think either by Toni Morrison or Alice Walker. It was about how to stay in contact with people who have been harmful or something like that.
Anything we love can be saved.
Okay. And
Yeah.
who's the author, please?
Alice Walker.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, I just wanted to say that you and your team did an outstanding job in putting together opportunities to have courageous conversations, balanced by the research. You talk about DWEC, you talk about teacher perceptions and influence on student outcomes, being able to have the theories and tenets of restorative mindset, the practices, self-reflection activities, recognizing the importance of self-awareness and self-reflection, at the same time developing the systems and structures to do analysis around that, to put all of that into a 2-day training and to have the level of engagement is remarkable. I truly enjoyed it. And I just want to say that it's a continual, I always look at, and I think everyone who's, in the field of mental health and psychology is, it starts first with us. And that message was very clear, the importance of self-awareness and self-reflection, and then that relationship building and the width. If we just take those major tenets, I think we can continue to move forward in a trajectory to ensuring that we are doing what we need to do for everyone, and of particular people of color. and those that are disenfranchised. So I just want to say I enjoyed it tremendously. I want to continue to take this work to Arlington Public School as we continue to do equity and inclusion and diversity work. And I will probably be, you are HBCU, Morgan State University. So I love my HBCU.
I don't know about that little social group you're part of, but we could discuss that later. I ain't gonna get on my nerves in November. I know that.
That's the GSP or something. But okay, I just want to say I enjoyed it, and keep going, and I'm going to continue to network with you and your team.
Thank you so much for being here. Do we have any more questions or commitments?
I did have a quick question. I want to be mindful of your time. You have been so gracious with all of us. And again, I echo everything Aleta just said, and many of the people have been putting in the comments. You can absolutely hear your passion for how children are treated in our communities in everything that you say. I would love a little input from you on the adultification of children in relation to language. As a first responder, I've seen that occur many, many times. You get in a situation in which the children in the household may have a common language with someone coming into that household where the adults in the household do not. And the child is put in a very difficult place of essentially acting as a translator for a conversation they should probably not even be a part of.
I'm glad that you brought that brought that up, because I think that really speaks to the systemic issue, right? That is in place. And it's also I'm thinking about the conversation around defunding the police, the military, and ICE, right? Because in these situations where first responders, it would be impossible for first responders to learn millions of languages, right? Like, unless someone comes up with a robot that knows every single language on this globe that travels around, it's just not going to happen, right? However, if we know that there are folks who have been researching through mutual aid funds, through community responsive teams, through alternatives, transformative justice, restorative justice, figuring out ways we can depend on the community for those situations like that. And so really, again, like understanding the structural impact of it and being able to, and the resources that are available and are not yet available that can help with that. Because the short answer for that is like, who are you willing to take the time to go through the communities that you are, where you spend a lot of time, right, and cultivate. And I think is Priya still on here? No, she's not.
You had to go to another training.
I'm thinking about, and Laurel, you probably know what I'm talking about. It looks like there's like a chart and that has like bubbles on it where folks in the community identify who can be called and for what. I think some folks may have seen that.
Contact web, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And to me, like, that's only a short term solution, right? That's something that can be helpful, but long term, right, we have to consider what does it look like to actually invest in our communities and fund our communities in a space where when we are responding to trauma, when we are responding to conflict, there are folks in the community that have the language, right, in terms of the cultural, like the native tongue, dialects, right, even in how we're showing up physically, that has connection to the community that can serve in that capacity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think that in Alaska, they've done a lot of work in relation to interactions of first responders in Native American groups and ensuring that the person that shows up, like you said, has that connectivity, the dialect, the culture, the connection, is a member of that community, because that's a huge thing there. Thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, right, like even like in our systems right now, like that's just the short term, right? If we're looking at the long term, if we're looking at really building a restorative community, right, we have to consider what it will look like to actually start to trust and build with communities a way to, one, build those relationships, but also respond to conflict. right? Because that would then we have that space where our children don't have to be put in that predicament.
Well, you're fabulous. It was wonderful.
Thank
Big
you.
heart to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate you all so much. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and then
we want to do more. We want to do more.
Looking forward to it.
I definitely would totally love any more of these to be able to just sit in.
Yeah. Barb has more. She has a whole menu full. This is the beginning. This is the first one.
Oh, no, I'm Sigma Gamma Rho, the best one.
Okay, all right, you came a little after us, but you know, it's all respect.
Listen, last created, best designed.
Have a really good night, Barbara. It was fabulous, and go Bears.
It was.
Yes.
Have a good night.
Great job, Barb.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barb.
Amazing.
Thanks, everybody.
Ladies, you're all wonderful.